This is a podcast about new crops. You're going to love it. Join us on The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin. So it sounds like a couple cycles of recurrent selection has made some progress.
Huge, huge,
Yeah.
and I think that we are just at a point where that rate of genetic gain per generation is going to really accelerate.
Welcome to The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin. I'm your co-host, Jerry Clark, with the Division of Extension with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, serving as an agricultural agent in Chippewa County. Joining me today as my co-host is Jason Fischbach.
Hi, Jerry. Well, we've got a great show lined up today as part of our three-part series on chestnuts. And joining us is Ron Revord and Greg Miller. And first, guys, thanks for joining us today on, I guess, a cold November morning for us. We were 18 degrees last night. Ron, you want to just introduce yourself and how you're involved with chestnuts?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm a assistant research professor at the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry, where they've been doing chestnut research in a variety of ways for upwards of 20 years now. So I'm stepping into my seat as the tree breeder and geneticist, where I'll be working on chestnut as well as a few other nut tree species.
And Ron, you came from University of Illinois. Is that where you did your graduate work?
Yep. In 2019, I finished up my PhD there, working under Sarah Lovell and in close collaboration with Tom Molnar at Rutgers University and his colleagues with the Hybrid Hazelnut Consortium.
Great. And Greg, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Greg Miller. I'm a chestnut grower in East Central Ohio. Been doing chestnuts my whole life. My business was derived from my dad's nut growing hobby, which got out of control and became a business. Have a PhD from Iowa State in forestry, breeding, and genetics. So been interested in chestnut breeding really my whole life.
Cool. So maybe the first question for you guys, and if Greg, you want to take the first one here, is kind of give us an overview of chestnuts. I think most of our listening audience will know American chestnut, but that's not what we're talking about when we're growing chestnuts these days, right? We're talking Chinese chestnuts and hybrids. So could you just kind of give us an overview of the different species and plant material?
Okay, well, there are at least 7 species recognized in Castanea. Some people recognize more. Essentially, all the species will spontaneously hybridize with each other. And so there are lots of hybrids, for that reason, because the gene pool then comprises all the 7 species which occur in the northern hemisphere all around the world. Mostly for the Midwest, we think that the Chinese chestnut is kind of the anchor species or the main one. It is kind of the primordial species. It's in China is where chestnut originated. And I sort of think that all the other species are just derivatives of Castanea millissima, the Chinese. Also turns out climate-wise, disease-wise, there's a lot of reasons why the Chinese is best for the Midwest, because the climate in China sort of is closer to North America than the other places chestnuts grow. And the quality of the nuts is probably the best of all the species. Nevertheless, I think there are some characteristics we can bring in from the non-Chinese species that will help.
So why not American chestnut?
Probably the main reason is blight susceptibility and Phytophthora susceptibility. And the nut size is an issue. The Americans are generally too small. They're kind of remembered by people who don't actually have a memory of it as being the best tasting of all the chestnuts and the sweetest. But I don't think they're really much better than Chinese, and they might be different, and they do have a higher oil content, a little bit different flavor. I think we could use American chestnut maybe to bring in some nut quality characteristics, but it's not really essential. But the main problem is the disease susceptibility.
Ron, do you want to kind of give us an overview right now where chestnuts are grown in the U.S.? Where are the kind of production regions, if there are any right now?
Sure. Well, there is some production out west. There's growers in Michigan as well. And then there's growers throughout the Midwest, you could say, all the way from, Missouri up towards Greg's neck of the woods in Ohio, and extending to a lot of folks up into the Northeast, where they're basically trying to establish orchards. But the most, I guess, well-established industries would probably be the Michigan group is well-established. There's around a cooperative, and then there's now an Iowa group and an Ohio group that are established around a cooperative. But those are maybe groups of growers on the scale of several dozen. Is that about right, Greg?
Yeah, historically there was commercial production in the Southeast, like in Georgia, and there's a big grower in Pennsylvania who pretty much operates by himself from trees planted in the 1960s. There is a really growing interest in kind of New York and New England, especially kind of western Massachusetts, Hudson Valley, and in the Finger Lakes region. So, and there are people planting in the Southeast. So we cover a really broad climatic range, probably broader than any other commercial nut crop.
Any idea, say in the eastern U.S., how many acres are in commercial production? Say that people are harvesting the nuts and selling them versus just subsistence stuff.
I could tell you the number of growers offhand, but not the number of acres. The Midwest and neighboring states is around 500 growers as of the last ag census, so 2017. And it seems, based on what we know with like nursery affiliates and our seed sales from the Center for Agroforestry, that's increasing quite a bit. Most of those orchards are on the smaller side, though. Maybe 10 or tens of acres. I couldn't tell you offhand how many of those are of bearing age versus non-bearing age.
Oh, I was just curious, an earlier podcast, that range was kind of that southern Wisconsin, trying to move this crop maybe further north. In your work, Ron, as part of that, or Greg, is some of that going to be driven on, growing degree days as your breeding program to try to move this crop further north, or try to adapt it to all the growing regions? It just seemed like where we are in northern Wisconsin, we were right on the edge of maybe where it could grow. And then is that part of your work moving forward, is to try to move this crop into areas where it may not be, it's not growing at all?
If we look at where chestnuts are grown commercially in the world, it's almost exclusively in warmer climates than Wisconsin. And really the kind of the warm or mild temperate zones, like in China and in Europe and in Japan and Korea. And there are chestnuts native and commercial chestnut growers in China, somewhat north of 40 degrees north latitude, but not much. And so I think it is pushing the limit for commercial production. The European chestnut, was moved by the Romans all the way up to England, and there are even some in Denmark. But commercial production is only south of the Alps. So I think chestnuts seem to require a really hot summer, which means maybe the upper Midwest is okay if we can just get the trees through the winter, because they do like that hot, humid summer. That seems to be important.
And the winter hardiness, is that a matter of the vegetative parts surviving the winter? Is it spring frosts? Is it the fall ripening and maturity? Or what's the main limitation on the hardiness?
Both. I think spring frost is not that's not a northern thing. People in the southeast have more problem with spring frost than we do. But the winter hardiness, and I think there's certainly a lot of variation in the growing season. When the trees go dormant in the fall, and if they aren't fully dormant when the cold weather hits, like now, that can cause trouble.
So 18 degrees here this morning for me in mid-November, that would be lethal to the trees or cause a lot of damage?
Well, there are some trees which it would be lethal to if they haven't lost their leaves yet. And I see this where you look at all the native forest trees and they've lost all their leaves, and here you got these few chestnuts, and I'm thinking particular like the Dunstans, they still got green leaves on. And so, okay, this is not something that should be growing this far north. So I think it is a matter of choosing materials that kind of fit themselves to the growing season, know when to go dormant in the fall. And then there does seem to be some, deep winter minimum temperature that they can tolerate even after they're dormant. So there's maybe two things. There's adaptation to the growing season, and in particular going dormant when they need to go dormant, because they pretty much got to go dormant before it gets cold. So they have to anticipate what's coming, and that's.
And they're not, say in Iowa, when we interviewed Tom, do I have this right, that they're not dropping their nuts until end of September, early October?
Correct.
Is that okay? So they got to do that and then go dormant, all in that short little window before the cold weather comes. Okay.
Yeah, and that time of nut drop is surprisingly consistent, even in from Florida to Michigan. They might ripen like a week or two earlier in Florida, but it's not like a degree day thing like you might see with vegetables or maybe even some other fruits. I think the nut ripening time, it's probably closely tied to photoperiod with secondary effective temperature. And warm temperatures make them drop quicker than cold temperatures. So it does happen, especially in the Midwest. Sometimes we get a hard freeze before the nuts have dropped, and that can be devastating.
Well, we had 70 degrees last week, but 2 weeks before that we had 8 inches of snow. So if we could flip that around and make sure it comes in the right sequence, we might be all right.
Well, this is the big problem in the Midwest. Looking at the averages doesn't tell you the whole story. And any perennial crop has to deal with all those extreme weather events. And those, one weather event can affect the tree for years. Whereas if you have one weather event that ruins your corn crop, well, that doesn't affect next year's corn crop. Drought is another issue that, chestnuts are fairly drought tolerant, but a severe drought can hurt the trees, and they don't recover for 2 or 3 years.
So the traits or the requirements for adapting to like a Wisconsin environment are even goals for adapting to climates south of you. So the germplasm isn't necessarily even holistically ready to go in, let's say south of Chicago, like the band that would go across from Iowa to Ohio. Some of them are well adapted, many aren't. So still, even in that let's call it less extreme because it's south environment, you're looking to improve adaptability for winter hardiness, the season length, like we were talking about. And then you do have the added variable there of the spring frosts. Like this past year, spring frosts were a major issue where they had 2 events that took out initial growth and secondary growth. And there was a lot of crop loss. from Iowa to Ohio, with maybe exception to some of the growers, well, some genotypes maybe were escapes or they avoided it. And then there's growers up near the Cleveland area where the lake maybe tempered the frost just enough where those regions were able to escape it. But just to get an idea of where these like adaptation requirements are needed, it's not just in the upper Midwest, it's even just throughout the broader Midwest.
So that raises a good question to me is, those 500 growers or so that you mentioned, are they still mainly growing seedlings from hybrids, or is the cultivar development far enough along that growers are putting in larger blocks of single cultivars, or where are things at on deployment of some of this germplasm?
Single cultivars could maybe be considered but in a much narrower geography. So like the river hills of Missouri, where the Center for Agroforestry has tested grafted cultivars over long periods of time, like we're talking multiple decades, where there's very minimal graft failure for given cultivars. Maybe it's 10% or so, not economically impactful on a commercial scale. Like those areas can kind of be successful. Beyond that, it's, I think, mostly seedling based. And so a lot of it is open pollinated seedlings from particular cultivars. So a lot of half sibling families would be predominantly what's grown.
Yeah, just to kind of shed some more light on that, for regions that are not clear, chestnuts, especially Chinese chestnuts, suffer a lot of graft failure and even delayed graft failure, where you can have a successful graft that dies. Or sometimes you get trees that survive, but the graft union is so poor that nut size goes down and growth rate goes down and disease susceptibility goes up. We don't know why chestnuts are difficult to graft, but they are. And as Ron sort of alluded to, anytime the tree is exposed to any kind of stress, and usually water stress or cold stress, that tends to exacerbate the graft failure. So if you've got trees that are in a really good environment, well irrigated, and don't ever go through stress periods, they're more likely to survive. But I think as I look at why is there not a chestnut industry, and I think it's always hard to figure out a reason why something didn't happen. But I think certainly for chestnuts, one of the main contributors is the failure of grafted trees.
So why grafting versus tissue culture or layering? Why has that been the propagation approach?
Those methods haven't done any better. In fact, we tried rooting cuttings, thinking, okay, if we get rid of the graft union, we'd solve the problem. But short version of that, we stuck 10,000 cuttings, planted 100 trees in the field, and we got like 10 of them left. Before I abandoned that. But it seemed that the rooted cuttings fared no better than the grafted trees, and there seems to be something about the juncture between the adventitious roots and the tree was just as bad as a graft union. In other words, there's something magic about that root collar area of a chestnut tree that you don't get when you root a cutting or start a tree from tissue culture. I guess one of my hopes is somatic embryogenesis as a way to sort of produce clonal seedlings, but that technology is not developed well enough that we can propagate adult trees from somatic embryogenesis.
Got it.
So if there were a way to clonally propagate chestnuts, that would be a game changer. But right now we're using seedlings mainly because that's what works the best. And we just put up with the genetic variation that we have in a seedling orchard. But it's becoming pretty clear that in terms of growth rate and production, the seedlings will outperform grafted trees substantially.
So are you just starting out with
genetic-
higher planting densities and then weeding out the poor performing seedlings? Is that one strategy that's being used?
Yeah, that's an important component of the system, is to plant at a higher density than you want to end up with, and then remove the poorer performers as the trees come into production. And there also is, from an economic standpoint, you get more production early by having more trees per acre. And so there is, you don't, in other words, chestnuts may, I think at a spacing of 40 by 40, they can easily fill that space. They could even get bigger than that, but you don't want to start out your planting at 40 by 40. It just takes way too long to get enough production per acre. So I think even if we could, produce clonal trees, we probably want to start out at a higher density and then thin the trees as they get bigger.
Got it. Hey, Ron, from a breeding standpoint, do you feel like, well, Greg too, because you've been at this for a while, do you feel like you have a diverse enough breeding pool to start with here in the Midwest, or do we need more genetics from China? Do we need more hybridization to develop that pool, or is there enough potential in the existing germplasm to just start selecting?
There's unique variation that could definitely be added to our pool, probably focusing towards more northern climates in China. But to your question was to get started, I think that we definitely have requisite diversity in high quality selections or named cultivars to start a breeding program. And I guess I'll caveat that by saying, in many senses, that was already started 20 years or so ago. So the Center for Agroforestry, in partnership with Greg and Tom Wall, have basically sent this, or made the same pool of open pollinated seed from the cultivars in the Hark repository available to growers. And so that basically started the cycle of pre-breeding. By sending that material, it was a nice mixture of diversity, but high quality economic traits out to growers across a wide geography. And they've been doing it year after year. It's continuing this year. We sent out thousands of pounds of seed to almost 100 growers, some new, some old this year.
Oh.
So what that allows, after 2 decades, you build up a substantial pool of open pollinated sibling families in many different environments. And that's a great basis for pre-breeding, basically selecting those that appear to do well in these respective environments, with maybe the leading parameter or descriptor for doing well, in air quotes, being like stability in those environments. So not just, well, I guess there's 2 aspects to stability, right? There's like the climate variables that we were talking about, and is it adapted to the stressor, like the main stressors? Secondarily to that is, is it bearing the same amount year to year? So it's interannual stability, which can be one of 2 things, right? It could be just like alternate bearing, which might have genetic components to it, or different parameters. But it could just be a function of like being locally adapted to that specific area.
So I think to add to that, the history of improvement goes back farther than a couple decades. In fact, when the chestnut blight kind of ravaged the American chestnut, USDA imported a lot of Chinese germplasm, which was then planted out with the idea mainly we would have a species to replace American chestnuts, but they were broadly planted. The USDA distributed them to anybody who wanted. This inadvertently got a lot of germplasm introduced and distributed. And from some of those plantings, people said, oh, this does well here. Oh, this has potential as a nut crop. And I think if we look at the genetic diversity in chestnuts compared to other fruit and nut crops, I think the genetic base or the gene pool is huge. much bigger for castanea than for a lot of other tree crops that we grow. So I always say that the best thing about chestnut breeding is we got a broad genetic base, and the worst thing about chestnut breeding is we got a broad genetic base.
Right.
So it's a challenge to kind of evaluate and look through all the material that's available. But on the other hand, I think what we are now finding, even when we try to choose materials, for a specific area, like in Missouri, there's still a lot of variation that does well. So we have a long way to go and a lot of potential for improvement. It's kind of just a matter of being able to handle the huge genetic base that's available, and how to evaluate that. And that's kind of one of the beautiful things about the breeding program that Ron has started, is that kind of the genetic base is so big, we couldn't handle that in one institution. But if we can distribute the evaluation, across hundreds or maybe even thousands of growers, and have hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of trees under evaluation, that's something that's been kind of unprecedented in fruit crop breeding.
Well, that's a good segue to you, Ron. Can you tell us about your breeding program? I think I've read that you've got access to that Missouri clonal planting that's been there since 1996 or something. So yep. What else are you doing? What's a day in the life of a chestnut breeder looking like?
Well, I'll give you the broad strokes of how we're trying to build from past efforts to get that open pollinated seed out to growers, like we talked about before. So we were awarded a USDA grant in the spring to work with growers that have mature seedlings that were derived from our repository to evaluate those. So across about 20 different farms, we'll evaluate, we just finished the first year of this, like 400 to 700 trees. We'll probably add a few more next year. Unfortunately, we had that spring frost like I had mentioned earlier, so a lot of trees didn't have nuts on them this year. But point being, we'll evaluate those to basically select individuals that seem to be the best offspring in their respective environments, and develop core collections to kind of conserve those. And they can
what do you mean by best? What traits in particular are you measuring on those?
There's a whole host of traits, including DNA markers. So genetic diversity at neutral loci, we're reconstructing pedigree with those same markers. So even though they're open pollinated, more often than not, we should be able to find out who the male parent was. And then there's a host of economic traits related to nut and kernel quality and the relative variation within a given tree. Let's see here, architectural traits, and then a whole host of morphologies too. Altogether, there's probably, let's say, somewhere between 20 and 30 phenotypes within those categories.
A lot of work.
Yeah, it is. But
are there maybe like the top 3 traits that you'd say the industry is interested in?
Nut size is probably a leading trait. And then following that would be like aspects of kernel quality. So color, texture, sensory aspects. We'll also look at storage in subsequent years, because there's a storage mold issue with chestnut being more of a starchy crop rather than an oily crop. Actually, this past weekend, we just did our first pass through a sensory tasting with around 30 cultivars from the Hart collection, so that we could work towards building a lexicon. The material on farm now is great from a pre-breeding perspective. Very diverse germplasm pool. We're trying to basically identify those best individuals that can serve as next generation's parents. So we'll then kind of recreate the wheel of developing new offspring with those parents and disseminating them back out on farm so that those offspring can be the next generation of seedlings that compose orchards, rather than just continuing to use the same seedling sources. And we might try to, instead of it being just open pollinated seedling, wide diversity, in every geography, we'll try to take it from more of a pre-breeding phase to a breeding phase, where we're being a little bit more targeted with parent selection based on what we've learned over the last 20 years on what cultivars seem to be doing better where, and integrate control crosses into that scheme. So instead of open pollinated seedlings being planted out, it could be full siblings.
Yeah, I was just curious with some of the traits, is oil, protein, any of that being looked at? There's a big interest now in essential oils and all this kind of for nutraceuticals or food-based products, whatever it is. It seems like oil is trendy. Is that something that's being looked at, or some of the uses, alternative uses for the chestnut?
We have interest in that, and it fits within the theme of nutrient composition characterization that the Center for Agroforestry is trying to build out. But we won't be able to do that as a part of this grant, maybe the next one.
Right.
Some of those compositions play well into learning more about the sensory experience too. I think Greg was alluding to that a bit earlier when describing the American chestnut. The composition does change from species to species a bit.
Yeah, chestnuts are only 1 or 2% oil, and maybe Americans go up to 4%. So we're not talking about an oil crop.
Right.
But the little bit of fat that is there, that does really impact the flavor and the sensory experience in eating it. But I don't think it's mainly a starch crop. They're 80% starch on a dry weight basis, and so I think the oil content mainly impacts the flavor.
So are you looking at deploying more replicated yield blocks of your top individuals, or is that down the road still?
So we've done cultivar trials at Hark with maybe like 5 grafted replicates, but we might replicate that in some other areas, but it's more opportunistic based on what new growers want to do. So we do have a few new participants for our participatory breeding program that have interest in not just planting open pollinated seedlings or full SIP or control crosses, but maybe grafted plants too. And they're in more southern climates where there's at least a good expectation that they should survive long-term. We won't have delayed graft failure.
One of the big issues is that the performance of the grafted ramettes is so much different than the performance of the Ortet that it doesn't make any sense to make a grafted trial, because those grafts do not perform like the seedlings do.
Is that because of a rootstock effect, or just something about that graft?
Something about the graft. Certainly, I think there are such things as rootstock effects, but it's not just the rootstock. There are some grafts that perform as well as the Ortet. In other words, I've got like a whole grafted row of one cultivar, and everyone who's grafted trees has this experience. It's amazing if you put out 20 or 50 trees in a row of one cultivar, how much variation there is from tree to tree. That variation is at least as great as the variation amongst seedlings. And so, the idea, and in fact, that's what I started out, was we need to do some trials. But the reason there haven't been trials is because of that. It's not just graft failure, it's sort of a non-uniformity and poor growth of grafted trees.
You know, it's funny listening to this. There's a lot of parallels with the hazelnut world right now because it's so hard to graft or to propagate anything with American heritage and American hazelnut in the parentage. And it's almost to the point where you want to throw in the towel on vegetative propagation and just stick with seedlings and just deal with the variability, or, you know, like you said, plant higher densities and weed out, you know, the garbage. But I don't know, any thoughts on that? I'm listening to you guys. I'm not feeling real optimistic about clonal varieties anytime soon, or even as a.
Well, I think one of the encouraging aspects is I've been reading like old annual reports from the northern nut growers, and there was a period from the 1930s, and that's kind of when when Chinese chestnuts were introduced on a large scale, up through the 1960s, when you read about the performance of trees, and they basically did really poorly. And there were just a handful of selected cultivars that people were grafting, and they were at that time advocating grafted trees because the seedlings did so poorly. And I, you know, my dad planted trees in the late 1950s and 1960s. Most of those trees were just absolutely worthless from a commercial standpoint. But kind of since then, you know, maybe beginning kind of from the 1970s to the 1990s, there weren't a lot of us planting chestnuts, but those who were kind of zeroing in on those that did the best. And I think kind of from the 1990s on, you know, the people who are growing chestnuts have found, oh, here's material that works well. We finally crossed a threshold where we can plant seedling trees that produce commercially viable crops. Whereas before somewhere in the 1980s or 1990s, what seedling trees that were performed so poorly, there was no commercial potential. So it is a matter of kind of filtering out what is commercially viable, and there, you know, there was a time when most chestnut seedlings performed really poorly, and I kind of bristle every time I hear somebody say, well, I planted Chinese seedlings and they performed thus and so. Well, that does, you know, you didn't say which seedlings you planted, and it makes a big difference.
Yeah. So it sounds like a couple cycles of recurrent selection has made some progress.
Huge.
Yeah.
And I think that we are just at a point where that rate of genetic gain per generation is going to really accelerate. In other words, the best is yet to come.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So I guess there's one thing that I was going to add, and that's that I don't really see the material as something that I would recommend to growers as like a adoption, as like a clonal material. I view the cultivar collection we have at Hark, you know, about say up to 70 cultivars as breeding parents, more so. So to me, it's not really even a question of adopt seedlings versus grafted cultivars. We're still in this phase of genetic improvement, like Greg is mentioning, where it's really not even a question. It's just seedlings.
Gotcha. So what happened with Michigan with the European hybrids? There was Colossal at some point that was touted, I think, as kind of the end all be all, but that's gone away, or what's happening in Michigan these days? Because it's on a little different track than the Midwest, right? It's more of a European hazelnut or chestnut focus.
They still are producing a lot of Colossal. Every year they make up some excuse to cover the problems with Colossal. I mean, it's got a long list of defects. And I think it's got little future. There is some of the growers there are switching to other Euro-Japanese cultivars, and it does seem that, I think, especially in northern Michigan and especially in the fruit belt where they're trying to grow chestnuts, I think the summers are too cool, and the Chinese chestnuts don't do as well under those, places that are good to grow cherries are not necessarily good to grow chestnuts. So, and if you look at kind of the climatic adaptation of the various species, those that do grow in more cooler maritime climates are the European and Japanese, because they come from maritime climates. But those that are in the Chinese chestnut seems to require that really hot, long summer, which which I think is not what most of the fruit belt in Michigan has. You get into central Wisconsin, actually it's hotter than in Michigan. Certainly Michigan does not have adequate genetic material, and the farther north you go, I would say the more need there is for a breeding program because there's less material that's adapted. We always joke, I think I'm as far north as you can grow chestnuts, and Bob Staley, who's 2 hours north of me and part of our co-op, he thinks he's at the northern limit of where you can grow chestnuts. So as we keep pushing farther and farther north into shorter growing seasons and colder winters, it starts to narrow down, the genetic materials that are available. There's a big task yet to discover, what will do best in Wisconsin, what will do best in Michigan, and basically if anything does well somewhere, how far can we move it and have it still do well? These are unanswered questions that I think partly what we can do with the participatory breeding program, where we got growers in a lot of different climates, and a lot of them have planted the same families, the same genetic material. So we will discover, well, do the offspring of Ching do well in Wisconsin, or do they do well in Alabama, or questions like that.
The Center for Agroforestry has got a really nice publication about chestnuts, and it lists nurseries that are available. Are nurseries primarily just selling half siblings they've collected from, say, their best plant, or are they, is anyone offering full sibling families? Are people offering cultivars? Where is the nursery side of things at, or what's the best way for folks to get plants these days?
So half sibling families are sent from our program to several nurseries, including Greg's, Tom Wall at Red Fern Farm, and Forest Keeling, a little north of St. Louis. I'm not sure if Greg or Tom provide half sibling material to a second tier of nurseries, but I don't think so. And then starting in, make sure I get this right, 2021, so yeah, next year, we'll have full sibling material, but obviously that'll be at a lower supply than the open pollinated material. And most of next year's is already designated for certain participants, but hopefully we'll be increasing the ability to produce full sibs up to, I guess, a goal of around 10,000 a year from then on. So it's always good to kind of be proactive and reach out if full sibs are of interest. So we've already started making a short list of participants interested in full sibs for 2022. I'm not sure you can get full sib material anywhere else, or it's really only relevant because the nature of this program being centered around genetic improvement. I don't believe other nurseries would really be offering full sib material.
I think one of the problems is that until we do some progeny testing and can identify trees with good specific combining ability, the advantage of full sib, which is expensive, versus, open pollinated or half sib, which is relatively cheap. And just calling it half sib, you know, every mother tree that you collect seed from is surrounded by the potential fathers, and it makes a difference what those are. And so if you're in a situation like Hark, where all the potential fathers are good cultivars, then I'm not sure that you would gain much from making a cross between two particular parents versus one parent and an array of other good parents. You know, until we know that these, you know, mother A and father B make better offspring than mother A and father C. But, you know, so at this point, in other words, I get seed from Hark simply because they're you know, every mother tree is surrounded by other grafted trees who, you know, the potential fathers are, one, all good ones, and two, genetically different, or at least presumed different from the mother. Now that would contrast, you know, there's a couple of the ortets, you know, of the clones at Hark that I have in my orchard. And I could collect seed from the ortet of Peach or Gideon or some of the other good parents, but they're surrounded by mediocre trees that are probably relatives. So they're surrounded by their siblings. So there we would have an inbreeding problem. We would also have the fact that, you know, the potential fathers are just not quite as good as the potential fathers at Hark. So I think there are certainly ways to make open pollinated half sib families better. And ultimately, if we found two really good parents, we could make a biclonal orchard and just collect open pollinated seed and then know both parents. The problem is time. That would take decades. And by the time we picked out those two parents, some of their offspring might be way better parents than those original parents were anyway. And so we're always, you know, fighting this lag of, once we identify good parents, we identify those with their good offspring. Now we should use those good offspring as the parents instead of going back to the original ones in order to make the best gains. So we're always going to be kind of guessing as to who the best parents are. But I think at this point, with the potential for the rapid gains, just picking out good parents who are not related to each other or who are not very closely related to each other, and making crosses between them it works.
So if a grower wants to get involved, is there a website they should go to? Do they work through a local grower cluster, or how do they get involved to be part of this process?
At this point, they can get in contact with me or one of my lab members. So we'll be developing a lot of informational material this winter prior to the start of the next growing season. So overviews of the program, you know, kind of the broad strokes on like the biology and genetics of what we're doing and why it's important for the program to be decentralized and not just be held at an institute. The benefits of it being participatory, so like an exchange of information between like an institutional program like our lab and the knowledge of growers. I mean, the depth of knowledge that you find in growers that have been like Greg, for example, or even growers that have been doing it for 5-10 years is incredible. Especially how intimately they know that they're given orchards and like their favorite trees or their local markets and how that information could get fed back into the program. Without digressing too much more on those benefits, we'll basically have a lot of informational material to communicate that. And other resources we're developing too. So we'll add a web page to the soon to be coming new Center for Agroforestry website. And then we also have a germplasm management database that'll be available. We're a few days away from purchasing. It's another one of those COVID era obstacles, but we're like 6 months into trying to get this germplasm database set up to manage all this on-farm material, and
Right.
any day now. So, anywho,
So maybe less. Oh, go ahead, Greg.
I was going to say, I know from, from my customer base and from the people I interact with, there are a lot of people who are really, they're saying, how can I participate in this program? So there's a lot of enthusiasm among growers to get involved. And a lot of these growers that I'm talking to are in the Northeast and in the Southeast, kind of out of the radius range of, the Missouri people to drive in a day. So they're not really working with them, but there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm among growers to move forward with this, and I'm excited about that.
Yeah, right.
so that's a really good point to bring up, if you don't mind, Jason. So we've gone and we plan to travel and have to these on-farm locations that are kind of in the Midwest. So Iowa over to Ohio, maybe like Kentucky to Missouri, that box, and do a lot of the on-farm evaluations. We ourselves, our lab, if you're outside of that range, it doesn't mean that you can't engage and participate in the network. We could provide sort of the resource support, the what and the how, so that efforts, in the Northeast or the Southeast are coordinated and done in a similar fashion to what we're doing on farm, my lab. That way the efforts are more directly comparable, or we could tap into a broader diversity, a broader gene pool that could really benefit the whole.
Right. So my last question, and Jerry, I don't know if you've got a final one too, but my last question is, talking to Tom Wall and our previous guest, Roger Smith, it's, the markets are there, growers plant these seedlings and go, because you can make money off these plantings right now. Do you share their enthusiasm, or are you a little bit more cautious?
We sold out in less than 24 hours. And that's the experience of every grower that I know, is that they could probably sell many times their own production. And it's like, once people find out that you have chestnuts, they about break your door down. We had people drive for hours, just showed up, and they wanted to pick their own chestnuts. We never invited them. We didn't know they were coming. It's like, your website says you were sold out. I just want to come pick some. So it's kind of unusual to have a problem like that we just don't have enough production to satisfy the demand. And it's interesting to me, even though we are, China is the world's leading producer, and they are exporting more and more to the US, but all my Chinese customers do not want to buy those chestnuts from China. They want to buy chestnuts that are produced in America, because they trust them more. So on the one hand, I'm somewhat concerned about, our market getting flooded with cheap chestnuts imported from China. But so far, my customers are willing to pay 2 or 3 times as much to buy something that was produced locally.
Yeah, right. Fresher, and especially chestnuts, that matters, right? Big time.
Yeah, there's no produce item that's presented to consumers in worse condition than chestnuts are in a lot of supermarkets.
Yeah, right. Jerry, any last questions?
No, I just make a comment. I think, activity like this, where you've got the university connecting with growers and trying to move this crop in a forward where more people can grow it, the market's there. We usually don't see that in agriculture very often, where we usually flood a market, and here's a market that's ready to go, and we just got to get the word out that here's an opportunity, and let's look forward. You got people like Ron and Greg to help move it forward. They're willing to share that information, and it's really appreciated.
Well, great, guys. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks a lot. It was nice to chat with you guys.
brought to you by the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension.